Well, Briahna, what's on your radar?
Robbie, what might be the biggest welfare fraud of the decade just got worse. As we've covered here on Rising, NFL quarterback Brett Favre took $5 million allotted for needy families for speeches he never gave and to build a volleyball stadium at his daughter's college. Now there is new breaking news. 2 years after scamming Mississippi's poor out of money they needed to survive, Favre tried to get additional money from the state's welfare agency for a new football facility, the Clarion Ledger reports. Now, as a brief recap, this scandal is part of a larger fraud and embezzlement scheme in which $77 million were stolen from poor families. And it's the biggest public fraud case in Mississippi history. Because of a Clinton-era policy, federal money distributed under the welfare program known as TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, could be distributed as block grants to states instead of being distributed on the basis of need. Now, the rationale was that block grants allow states more flexibility in how they use federal money. But this scandal reveals exactly why that can be a problem. Block grants allow states to shift the federal funds to other purposes. And as we learned earlier this month in Mississippi, those purposes included millions of dollars for Brett Favre's pet projects. Now, Favre's claim that he did not realize the funds he got came from the poorest people in America's poorest state might have been reasonable at first blush. As a sport philosophy professor at George Washington University pointed out in the New York Times, it's not uncommon for individuals to secure grants without knowing exactly where the money is coming from. But text messages that came out earlier this month blew up that lie. In the text between Favre and the director of a community education nonprofit, Favre asked, quote, "If you were to pay me, is there any way the media can find out where it came from and how much?" The director, Nancy New, confirmed that she had, quote, "just gotten off the phone with Phil Bryant, Mississippi's then governor, and that Bryant was, quote, on board with us." Now, neither Bryant nor Favre have been criminally charged, and Favre has repaid $1 million he was given for speaking fees, minus nearly $250,000 in interest still outstanding. But wait, there's more. Favre had told a local paper that he had not discussed building a volleyball facility with former Governor Bryant. But new texts show that during September of 2019, Favre texted Governor Bryant pressing him for money to pay for the facility. Quote, "We obviously need your help big time, and time is working against us. And we feel that your name is the perfect choice for this facility, and we are not taking no for an answer!" Exclamation point. Governor Bryant responded, "This was a great meeting, but we have to follow the law. I'm too old for federal prison." Such restraint. Moreover, back in 2017, the year Brett's daughter started at the University of Southern Mississippi, Favre texted Governor Bryant, quote, "Obviously, Southern has no money, so I'm hustling to get it raised." A few hours later, he texted, "Of course, I am all in on the volleyball facility. One thing I know how to do is raise money." Apparently. But wait, it gets worse. Former WWE wrestler Teddy DiBiase Jr. has alleged that Phil Bryant redirected welfare funds away from a nonprofit that needed it to help the poor because, quote, "the nonprofit director was a supporter of the Democratic candidate for governor that year." An action that, of course, benefited the current Republican governor, Tate Reeves. This was reported on yesterday's episode of the New Abnormal podcast over at the Daily Beast. But wait, there's more. According to 2018 texts, Brett Favre reportedly suggested using prison labor to build the volleyball facility for his daughter's school. Look, to be clear, these are federal dollars that the governor's office has the sole discretion to disperse. It doesn't go through the state legislature. Blame cannot be dispersed. And the governor's office chose to give millions of dollars to fund an already multimillionaire man's whims. So let's take a look. What else was going on in Mississippi at the time? Well, at the time of the scandal, the cash checks available to the poor in Mississippi hadn't increased in decades. Poor families could get a mere $170 a month for a family of 3. Meanwhile, 99% of people who applied for that meager cash welfare benefit were denied assistance altogether. By contrast, Brett Favre's net worth is over $100 million. It's important not to skip over who this hurt. For example, the most common cause for family separation is neglect. And neglect is often a crime of poverty. 75% of children flagged by the system are not abused. Their families are just too poor to take care of them properly. So imagine you are a family whose children were put into the foster care system due to neglect. Who could have really used that $170 check to feed your family or keep a roof over your head? Oh well, at least a millionaire's daughter has a new volleyball facility. Mississippi is currently going through a water crisis, as we've covered here on Rising. 2 days ago, the Department of Justice said the water was not safe, and in fact said it was prepared to file an action against the city of Jackson under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Residents of Jackson have lacked access to safe and reliable water for decades. The capital city of a state in the richest country in the world. And in that context, the state's former governor was handing out freebies to millionaires. And the current governor, I'm afraid he's hardly off the hook. Local reporter Anna Wolf has pointed out that it's a conflict of interest for Governor Tate Reeves to be in charge of the embezzlement lawsuit that has implicated Brett Favre. She says he should in fact be a target of it. The former welfare director, John Davis, who is facing criminal charges in this scandal, said he was doing Governor Reeves' bidding when he funneled over $1 million to Reeves' fitness trainer, a defendant in the lawsuit. Governor Reeves also recently fired the attorney who had brought the welfare suit in the first instance after he attempted to subpoena the University of Southern Mississippi Athletic Foundation for its communications with, among others, Governor Bryant. Communications which we now know are pretty incriminating. This is after Reeves' staff had forced the U.S. attorney to remove the Athletic Foundation from the lawsuit before he filed it. It won't surprise you to learn that the Athletic Foundation board is made up of Reeves' supporters and campaign donors. Meanwhile, while residents of his capital are unable to get basic services available in much poorer countries in the global south, Reeves has withheld Jackson water repair funds, claiming fiscal conservatism, according to recent reporting. While Reeves has blamed Jackson's water issue on city mismanagement, he has for years bowed to political pressure to abandon the residents of Jackson, who were cast as undeserving takers in all of this. In 2011, while engaged in a battle for the lieutenant governor's seat, Reeves was pressured by the ongoing Tea Party movement to explain why he had approved money for bond projects as a member of the State Bond Commission. Reeves, courting Tea Party support, told the truth when asked. He explained that he wasn't approving every bond project. There were many that didn't even get to the approval stage because he simply didn't take up issues he didn't want to approve for a vote. Among the bonds Jackson had required, a bond to repair its crumbling water and sewer infrastructure. While some funding made it through, typically money funded by a sales tax on Jackson's poor residents as opposed to state funds, this is a pattern we see repeatedly across the country. Politicians use their positions for self-enrichment, sacrificing poor and working people of all races and backgrounds in the process. The conservative Tea Party actors that wanted Reeves to cut government funds didn't, in fact, end up advancing populist interests. At the end of the day, corrupt politicians too often are encouraged by right-wing movements to withdraw what limited support exists for working people and poor people, while real government waste, corruption, is ignored. Now, I'm not interested in beating up on these governors for being Republican or conservative, but I am interested in asking conservative populist voters to take a good hard look at how arguments for fiscal responsibility often mean fiscal responsibility for the poor and giveaways for the rich. Just look at how Trump's tax cuts went overwhelmingly to the 1%, or how elites were as silent about PPP funds going to the very rich as they were loud about student debt cancellation, or how quickly both parties shut down the child tax credit that had halved child poverty. Real populism focuses on the needs of the people: food, water, shelter, education. These are the primary functions of government on which businesses can be built and societies can thrive. Whatever you think about a transports policy or the 1619 project, that's not populism. It's identity politics. Many politicians on both sides of the aisle are hoping you vote based on a woke or anti-woke identity rather than on a candidate's ability to improve your material condition. That is, your ability to thrive financially. As a left populist, I have no hesitation in calling out Democrats like Clinton for reforming welfare so that it can be exploited the way Mississippi's leaders exploited it. Or calling out figures like Pelosi for resisting common sense laws that would ban her from using insider knowledge in the stock market, enriching herself with information she's supposed to be using to serve the public interest. All I ask is whether you'll do the same when conservative leadership advocates for fiscal responsibility for the poor while they bend the rules for elites like Brett Favre.
But can you find an example of a Republican or conservative or a limited government intellectual voice who is not outraged about the Brett Favre situation? I mean, I think that's clear crime and fraud and bad and really bad. We talked about it. I condemn it. I just don't think. I think you wouldn't find anyone who wouldn't condemn it.
Well, the question isn't whether or not you'll condemn Brett Favre. It's whether or not you'll take a step back and see it as part of this broader scheme, a bipartisan scheme, to increasingly divert public funds in ways that can be used to enrich elected officials, and that this is a really important part of the. I think
that was a chief complaint of the Tea Party movement, was the exact thing you just said.
Right, which is what I'm pointing out here. The irony of this movement, I think on some level wanting to be a populist movement, some of it was astroturfy, but there were some real people who wanted real populism, to get more rights to be turned to the people, more. The idea was that if by cutting entitlement, so-called entitlement programs, they would be able to keep more tax dollars in their pocket and their lives would improve. The reality is the same people who are walking around pandering to this idea of fiscal responsibility are in fact using their position to enrich themselves and further corruption. And I hope that there's some accountability here and some real consideration about whether or not some of the rhetoric that comes out of movements that purport to be populist is exploited by politicians in this very way. And I think there's frankly a lot of gains to be had between populists on the left and populists on the right who are similarly invested in ending corruption, similarly invested in stripping power away from elites to do exactly these kinds of things, to advance policies that attack those human beings, those corrupt parties, instead of putting so much focus on stripping entitlement programs that are supposed to benefit the very poorest and most vulnerable among us.
All right, I agree, I guess, then, that focusing on getting rid of like all entitlements or all welfare can seem misplaced, if that's your point, can seem misplaced when there's so much fraud of this kind. But I mean, frankly, getting this specific kind of fraud, the stadium subsidies, is something perverse that happens everywhere.
Absolutely.
That really does get complained about a lot by what you would refer to as Tea Party. I mean, I guess I don't know what Tea Party activists do these days. Maybe it's just all pro-Trump to the extent it exists. But conservative think tanks, state-based think tanks. Every state has a libertarian, conservative, low tax, low regulation think tank that routinely complains about stadium subsidies or subsidies for the film industries that states always think it's a great idea. Let's give all these tax breaks to films, to Hollywood to start doing films here, and then we're going to create a whole film industry, and then they move there to do one movie because they're literally being paid by the taxpayers of the state.
Yeah.
And then a different state will come up with an even more obscenely generous program.
Yeah, it's a race to the bottom.
It's so stupid.
It's a race to the bottom. Look, there was a book written by sociologist, I guess you'd say, Heather McGhee, about something that she calls it drained pool politics. And it's this idea that politicians over history have been able to whip up antagonism against certain groups to justify cutting social programs that actually hurt the people in the group that votes for them, right? So we saw this a lot after integration orders came down across the South. A lot of these cities were so robust, they had swimming pools and wonderful public parks and a lot of public facilities that instead of allowing to integrate, many people decided just to shut them down. And she calls it drained pool politics because so many, the public pool used to be a real centerpiece of American life. And so many of them were filled in in the post-integration era, because people would rather not have that public benefit than share it with Black people. So that's obviously a kind of extreme example, but there are lots of ways in which I think poor people of all backgrounds. Or we really got into
skateboarding.
Okay.
No, I take your point.
Yeah, we just have to be clear-eyed about whether or not, hopping on some kind of trend, something that can sincerely irritate you. I'm not telling you how to feel about trans women in sports or 16 nights or anything like that, but just be careful that we're not prioritizing things that don't actually affect our lives most viscerally, most materially, most financially, in favor of some frolic and detour on the internet that we're all going to forget about in a few years.
All right, well, the fireworks have to wait for yet another segment. We're all getting along today. We'll have more Rising right after this.